Hey everyone, my name is Troy Myers.
And I'm Amanda Flo.
And this is our first time co-hosting the intro part of our regular Sunday night reading series, the Stonehouse Readers series. How are you, Amanda?
I'm great, thanks. And Troy, thank you for allowing me just the space to come in and join this time. I thought that both because I'm so excited about the readers that we have tonight, and because we were off last week, that maybe I would, pop in and just
Good.
check in with you and check in with everyone. And we have a couple of so there were just a couple of things that I was thinking it might be helpful to share.
Sure.
So we were off last week. We are maybe going to be thinking about updating the schedule soon. We haven't really had the time to make any decisions there, but we have been weekly, and we went weekly for, what was it, 17 weeks in a row,
17
every
weeks.
Sunday night, you and me here. Do you have any kind of standout memories or moments from the last couple of months, really, at this point?
You didn't tell me you were going to ask that, but I think every night has been so strong. It was very fun kicking off. Brady's read for us twice. I love seeing Brady read, my friend the poet. But we've had such fine readers, Katie Bickham, Indigo Moore, such excellent poets that I couldn't think of one highlight. I've enjoyed every single night. That's really true.
Well, I did spring this question on you, but also because I was thinking about a particular memory that I have over the last couple of months. And it was that we had someone come on who said that they signed up to join this reading series and said that she hadn't really been working on her memoir in progress, and that signing up for this reading series kind of was just like a little gentle motivation for her. And that was really, really meaningful to me. And so if there's anyone out there tuning in who is maybe stalling on picking up that pen or opening that Word doc again, this is a really safe space to give yourself that kind of deadline. And then we also kind of made a change in one of our policies a couple of weeks ago based on the feedback of some of our readers. And that is we are now, keeping these videos live for a couple of weeks. Around 2, I'm doing my best to kind of stay on track on that deadline. And then they go away. So if there's anyone who's interested in reading something that is maybe a work in progress or not published anymore, and you're worried about, well, where does this go? What happens to it? So it's online for a couple of weeks and then it goes poof. So that's something that we did directly in response to the feedback that we received. And I'm really happy to be able to accommodate that for everyone. And I think that was it. I'm so excited about both Robin and Melanie. I am personally very familiar with both of their work, and I think that I've heard maybe pieces from both of the works that they're planning on sharing, I think, today. So yeah, that was it. I just wanted to pop in and say hi and give a couple of updates. And Troy, do you feel ready to take it from here?
Sure, of course.
Okay. Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
So well. Amanda, you never have to apologize for poking your head in here. This is your show. You're producing it. I'm just up here ranting. So wonderful to have you pop in. We should do that more often. If you're just joining us, my name is Troy Myers. Again, I'm a graduate of the Stonecoast MFA in Creative Writing. That is hosted at the University of Southern Maine. It's a creative writing program, and it has poets and fiction writers and what we call sometimes speculative fiction or popular fiction, which is horror, fantasy, science fiction, and all sorts of cross genres, as well as what's called creative nonfiction, which is what we're hearing tonight. Creative nonfiction is memoir, personal experience, true stories from from person's lives. I think that Amanda just mentioned that we're going to look at the summer schedule. We went 17 straight weeks, took 1 week off. I don't know how many are actually going to see the video who might sign up, but I'm thinking maybe we might do twice a month through the summer. And I'll be recruiting. So I have some names down of people who, like Chelsea Everett, who were going to read and then couldn't. And so I'll be hunting you down. The other thing I'll say, first of all, a shout out to my mom who watches, I want to say religiously, every Monday morning, the tape, and also to Amanda's mom who also watches. So we always have at least 2 in our audience. I'm especially excited tonight because our 2 readers and myself and Amanda are all from the same class. We all graduated summer of 2015. We were a crazy group. Some of us more crazy than others, like me and Brady and John and some of my friends. But we felt madly in love with each other. I have a note saying Melanie was 1 semester before us. She's right. It was January 15. I apologize. But she was there at the same time. And we bonded together just out of our insecurities, our fears, our need to feel part of something. It's a sensitive work, writing creatively, and you need support. And that's what our class and all of us there at the same time did for us. So other than that, I've talked a lot at the beginning. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our first reader, who is Melanie Brooks, who's reading creative nonfiction. Hey, Melanie.
Hi, Troy. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I got your semester off by 1.
No worries. I really loved your class, so I hung out with people in your class a lot. We had a very small class. We lost some people along the way, and so, yeah.
Yeah, I remember you from there, so I just thought you were part of that crazy group, but you were part of the crazy group. What are you reading tonight for us?
I am reading from my memoir in progress called A Hard Silence. Do you want me to set the context, or?
Sure, yeah.
Sure. So in 1985, my father, this is it in a nutshell, kind of the context. In 1985, my father was infected with HIV-tainted blood during open heart surgery. And because of the culture and stigma around AIDS at the time, and also because of, at that time, we were also deeply involved in the evangelical Christian church, my father chose to keep his illness a secret without recognizing or having any idea that we would be keeping that secret for close to 10 years before his death in 1995. So that's kind of the contextual background of the book, but it's really exploring the consequence of secrecy and silence. And so the book's structure is not chronological. It kind of jumps back and forth in time, but there are these kind of a narrative thread that weaves throughout that lack of chronology. It are some moments spent in the therapist's office that kind of create windows to some of the themes that I discuss in the book. And so that's the chapter I'll be reading from tonight.
Great. It sounds fantastic, Melanie. The time's all yours. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much. So this is a chapter entitled What We Didn't Say. Dr. B had drawn the shade on his window to keep the sharp afternoon sun out of my eyes, but slivers of light sneaked through the slats and crisscrossed the space between us. Dust particles danced across their paths. You know what's weird? I asked him, setting my empty Dunkin' Donuts teacup on the floor at my feet and clasping my hands together in my lap. What's weird? He volleyed. So much of the stuff we talk about in here is stuff I wish I could talk to my dad about. I paused, trying to shape the thought in my head into the right language on my tongue. The weird part is that I wouldn't be talking about any of this if he was alive. I wouldn't have to. I couldn't help smiling when I added for unnecessary clarity because of the him being alive part and all. Dr. B smiled too. His eyes crinkled at the corners and dimples dented his cheeks. I get it, he said. It makes sense that you'd want to connect with him about these painful emotions. His face grew serious again. That's one of the biggest tragedies in your whole story for me. What part? That you didn't feel like you could talk about the pain of your experience when your dad was alive, with either your dad or your mom. We'd covered this territory before, more than once. It was a hard reality for me to face, the residual damage inflicted by my family's culture of silence during the 10 years my dad was sick, in the 19 years after. Dr. B wanted me to admit that I was angry about it, angry at my dad. He hadn't come right out and said it, but I knew that was where we were headed. There had been more than a few, "What did that feel like for you?" and "How do you feel about that now?" in our most recent sessions. These standards from the therapy playbook used to make me want to run straight out his door because I was not prepared to talk about how I'd really felt then or how I really felt now. I'd gotten used to these questions, though, and I was usually willing to answer them honestly, except when it came to admitting I was angry at my dad. I didn't feel ready to do that. I was also not completely convinced that I had a right to be angry. Among my earliest memories of my father is this. He's coming through the front door of our house on 64 Centennial Drive in Moncton, New Brunswick. It's already dark outside and a cold rain patters against the windows. He's missed dinner because of an emergency that kept him late at the hospital, and a plate with a heaping portion of the chicken casserole topped with cornflakes that Mom served the boys and me for dinner is warming in the oven under a layer of tinfoil. From where I'm perched, playing with my Barbies on the hallway's carpeted floor at the top of the stairs, I see him step into the tiled entryway and brush the damp off of his navy trench coat. The slope of his shoulders and the creases in his forehead betray his exhaustion. He carries his boxy, rectangle briefcase in his left hand. Inside the hard-sided case, I know there are cream-colored file folders with papers about his patients. Charts, he calls them, when I ask what he's doing on the days he sits at his desk and in a low voice using words I don't understand, talks into the small black handheld recorder holding tiny cassette tapes. For a slight moment after he walks in, Dad stands without moving, his gaze trained forward. I have a feeling that he's not really looking at anything. He pulls in a deep breath of air and blows it out again in a long sigh. "Hi, Daddy," I say, peeking my face through the staircase's metal railing. His eyes turn upward and a smile lights his face, erasing the tired lines. "Hi, Melanie Joybells," he says, and releases his grip on the briefcase, pushing it into the corner by the door. I abandon my Barbies in a jumbled heap and dash down the stairs into his outstretched arms, feeling the wet from the rain on my cheeks. "How was your day?" he asks, kicking off his dress shoes and unbuttoning his overcoat. I launch into an animated account of how Madame Arsenault, my first grade teacher, read us a story that day totally in French, and I'd understood almost every word. It was about this brother and sister named Rémi and Aline, and they were going to their first birthday party, I tell him, as we walk toward the kitchen, my arms still stretched around his waist. I often replay this memory and that pause in the scene when my father stood still, looking nowhere, before setting down his briefcase. What I understand now is that a shift was taking place, a moment of transition. On the other side of our front door, my father was Dr. Messenger, the thoracic surgeon who'd spent his day in an operating room, removing tumors from lungs, repairing traumatic injuries, and doing the intricate work of mending valves and vessels in people's chest cavities. The doctor who had likely that day delivered the terrible diagnosis of cancer to numerous patients. The practitioner who'd inhabited a world of high stress and unrelenting pressure. On this side of the door, though, he was Dad. To be Dad, he had to put down the events of his day, put down his briefcase full of charts detailing prognoses and treatment plans and surgical outcomes, and leave it in the entryway. He couldn't carry its weight with him into the world of our family. My father knew how to compartmentalize his emotions, set them aside to focus on what was in front of him. I don't know if his brilliant scientific mind was already wired that way, or whether he learned the skill when he went to medical school and was trained in the art of professional detachment to help him cope with the distressing waves of fear, self-doubt, grief, and pain that inevitably accompany dealing with life and death situations every day. I don't know if the ability was already established long before then, from his childhood living in the shadow of the Baptist tradition, in which biblical directives to, quote, fear not, to be, quote, slow to anger, and to, quote, not let your hearts be troubled, might have mistakenly told him displays of emotion were sinful. What I do know is that my father's practice of coping with hard emotions became the gold standard for our family, a standard that remains intact today, close to 25 years after his death. Don't dwell, don't look back, let it go, and just keep moving forward. I've spent my entire life trying and always failing to meet this standard. Unlike my father, and maybe my mother and my brothers, I'm not wired to put the hard things down, to let them go. I gather them all, clutching them tightly to my chest. How was it fair for me to be angry with Dad because of my own inability to conform? I decided to risk taking a step closer, though. Did I ever tell you that when my parents were writing their book in those last 2 years before Dad died, he asked each of us kids to write down our thoughts about what it had been like for us to deal with his illness? I asked Dr. B and stared at my hands, running my index finger along the jagged edge of a hangnail on my thumb. Dr. B tilted his head. I'm not sure you ever did, he said. I told him about the night when I was 21, how in the middle of dinner, my father had rested his fork on his plate, leaned back in his chair, and said to David and me, I'd like you guys to write down a few thoughts about how you felt about me being sick that I could include in the book. I'm asking Michael and Mark to do it too. He'd picked up his fork again and resumed eating. I'd stopped chewing my own food. Stunned, I'd looked from my father's face to my mother's, but their expressions held no hints that they viewed this request as anything out of the ordinary. I tried not to choke as I swallowed the mashed potatoes that were becoming slimy on my tongue. Okay, I'd managed to respond, fighting to keep the tremor I felt throughout my body from finding its way into my voice. Later that night, I'd sat down at my desk, a ballpoint pen gripped in my hand, and stared at an empty, lined piece of paper. What the hell was I supposed to say? For the first time in 9 years, Dad had asked me what living with the secret of his HIV status had been like. Except he hadn't actually asked me to tell him in a way that would allow us to talk about it. He'd told me to write it down for him to read. I couldn't stop imagining him sitting alone at his own desk, the weight of my words and whatever words my brothers wrote, too heavy in his hands. What would that do to him? I'd wondered. And for days, the ache in the question kept me from writing anything. Eventually, I said to Dr. B, I wrote a few things down because I knew if I didn't write something, he'd have to ask me again. What did you write? He asked. Not the truth, I said. My jaw tightened. His raised brows questioned my statement. I don't mean I lied, I said quickly. I was forever wondering what Dr. B was thinking, and despite his ongoing reassurance that I was allowed to say anything to him, I had this very real fear that he might think badly of me. I wrote about true experiences, true moments, but I chose my words really carefully. I told him I'd written some brief snapshots that touched on particular incidents when my understanding of AIDS had broadened or my recognition of how it impacted some of our family interactions had been clear. I wrote about my parents' suffering and their ongoing courage as they faced the unknowns of the disease together. I just didn't write how it really felt to be living with the secret, the uncertainty, how painful it really was, how lonely I felt, how confused and frightened. Why not? I looked at him and said, we'd never talked about those things, and here he was asking us to write it down and give it to him. How could I do that? Throw all those feelings at him on a scrap of paper? It must have been devastating for him to read the things we wrote. He didn't talk about it after you gave him what you'd written? Dr. B asked. No. A bitter taste filled my mouth as I recounted how I'd slipped quietly into the basement den that housed Dad's oak computer desk and hesitantly deposited next to his keyboard the 5 handwritten pages that had taken me over 4 hours to finish. In the weeks that followed, he hadn't said a word about them, and I hadn't asked. I had no idea what he'd done with the pages until the first time I read a printed manuscript of the book a few months later and came to the chapter titled Reflections, Dad Has AIDS. There, positioned among excerpts written by my brothers, were neatly typed paragraphs that quoted my words from those handwritten pages. I had been feeling at odds with Dad for a number of things. One day, after a particularly heated confrontation, I remember Mom turning to me and saying, "Don't you realize that he just wants to be sure you are all okay because he knows he may not be around to see the final product?" Finally, I understood what had been happening around me for so long, and for the first time, I understood my parents' pain because I felt it too. There were individuals on my college campus who somehow had heard through the grapevine about my dad. I felt violated, in a sense, because these were people with whom I was barely acquainted, but who somehow knew my most intimate secret. In a situation that could have torn them apart, Mom and Dad's love for each other has gotten stronger. I watch them take advantage of every moment they have together. There are times when I see Mom's grief and feel physically sick at the loss she has yet to face. These are emotions for which my Christian faith has largely been unable to provide solace. In their own personal accounts, my brothers had detailed moments and experiences when they'd had to cope with the grief and uncertainty of Dad's illness, things that we'd never talked about before. I'd instinctually known when I read them that we'd never talk about them after either. I still remember the evening that we sat down in the family room and Dad told us about the infected blood transfusion. A sense of numbness descended over us all. Even 8 years later, that feeling has never really disappeared. It is tempting and true to say that we have been blessed to have Dad alive and reasonably healthy for 9 full years, but they have been years lived day to day. Sometimes the specter of disaster is more difficult to deal with than if it were confirmed reality. I try not to dwell on Dad being sick all of the time. There are times when I won't think of it at all. I'll just sort of let it slide into the shadows and go on with my life. Other times it's on my mind a lot. My father had simply prefaced the chapter with these excerpts with, "The illness of a family member creates suffering for all other family members. The extent of that suffering for each of our children is difficult to gauge. It's not a subject we talk about often." It wasn't a subject we talked about ever, I told Dr. B. I untangled my fingers and wrapped my arms around my body, trying to contain the rush of feeling spreading through me. Dr. B knew my body language, knew how to adjust our course enough to give me a reprieve from emotions that felt too big. He leaned back, quiet for a minute, clasping and unclasping the silver watch on his wrist before he launched into an unexpected personal story. In the days after my mother died, my brother and sister and I decided to go through some of her things while we were all still together in Maine, organizing rooms, making plans for eventually clearing out the house. I opened a drawer in one of her bureaus and found stacks of her journals, full of stories and important events from her life. He paused, and a shadow of grief crossed his features. I picked up one of the journals on top and read the date, 2010, the year after my father died. I opened to the first page. She titled it, "The Year of My Loneliness." Dr. B's voice took on a tenor of sadness as he described how the journal chronicled his mother's intense anguish in the wake of losing her husband of over 50 years. His eyes brimmed with tears. It broke my heart. I had no idea how much she was suffering. Tears gathered in my eyes, too. The portrait of this solitary woman, letting her burden of sorrow seep from her pen to the page, was so tender and so painful. "I imagine you wish you could have helped her," I said softly. "I do," he replied. "But more than that, I wish she'd shared her sadness with us so we could have shared ours." He was giving me that pointed look of his. "Then," he said, his voice soft too, "we could have all walked through the pain together." Thank you.
Wow, Melanie, thank you for sharing that.
Thanks, Roy.
It is so courageous. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking you're talking about a really challenging therapy session, these deep family issues, and you're reading about it to all of us. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did your dad publish that book?
He did. Yeah, my parents published a book the year he died in 1995.
What was that called?
It was called Borrowed Time. And for a while, it was kind of the official story. And,
Yeah.
you know, I didn't think I had more to add. 350 pages later, I do.
Oh, I'm so glad. I mean, it was, well, what's the word? Almost eerie that when he reached out to you for, what you're experiencing, it was for a book.
Yeah. Yeah. I know, isn't
I
it?
need
Yeah.
some material, so tell me how you feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is this you said you were an evangelical Christian at the time? Is this memoir about faith also?
Yeah, it's been about kind of my crisis of faith through kind of recognizing that the church played a big role in the silence that we had to keep, and and just kind of exploring that aspect of the story as well.
Well, good. I have that in my background too. So both crisis and distant evangelical past. So
yeah,
look forward to reading it when it comes out.
Thank you.
Since you're writing it now, are you going to mention COVID at all? Since it's a
Um,
new pandemic and an old pandemic.
So I have a finished manuscript of it, and as I've been kind of querying agents and publishers for it, I have kind of made the link of COVID with it because there have been some eerie similarities. I wrote a piece for a website called Modern Loss in December, and wrote about kind of what I was seeing as a lot of kind of parallels and echoes of the AIDS pandemic at this particular time, and particularly about people grieving in isolation.
Wow. Where was that published?
It's called Modern Loss.
Mm-hmm.
It's a website that publishes essays and stories about grief and loss.
I knew that there.
Yeah.
Well,
the article was titled "Don't Forget This Happened," and that was
okay.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding when I say I want to read it, and I want you to come back, Melanie, maybe in the fall, and share some more of that incredible book.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks, Troy.
you're welcome. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
I am not worthy of this honor. My name is Troy Myers, and I am a graduate of the Stonecrest MFA in creative writing. If you're just tuning in, I don't know if that ever happens, but I feel like I should say that anyway for those of you tuning in. Stonecrest is a Master of Fine Arts in creative writing, including creative nonfiction, which is memoir and personal experience, lived experience, and that's what we're hearing from tonight. Two of our wonderful alumni sharing from their own lives and work. That was Melanie Brooks sharing from a yet unpublished memoir, which I hope is soon published so we can all read it. While I'm thinking of that, I actually ordered and finished, actually Anthony sent me a copy, and I finished Anthony Diari's Language of Men, who read on here a few weeks ago. Highly recommended. Fantastic first memoir book. So this is a cool hobby for me. And I read everybody's stuff when I can. I'll have more time over the summer. So I'm excited about our next reader, Robin Clifford Wood. Robin was in my class, the Crazy Fabulous Firsties of graduate summer of 2015. And Robin has a book release, a book that's just come out. That happens sometimes that someone has a book and they get on here and read. So we want to definitely give her credit and a little extra time if she needs it to talk and share about her story and a publication and the story of the book. So Robin, are you out there?
Here I am.
Hey, you. Good. And there it is, the field house. I love that.
There it
Very
is.
Professional.
In all its glory.
Yeah, it is a beautiful cover, as we were saying before we came on the air.
Yep, they found some stock photos after receiving a bunch of pictures of the island itself. If you see some of the photographs I have, the silhouettes of the shoreline are very reminiscent of this photo.
Fantastic.
So I was very pleased with it.
Good. So tell us the story of this book, because there's an interesting story here.
Yeah. Well, this small island off the coast of Maine, about a mile long and half a mile wide, has only about 20 houses on it. And one of them, my husband's family started going there in the 50s. So I discovered the island through him and their family home. And then in 1994, we found out this house was for sale that had been empty for 8 years and was in serious disrepair. And it had belonged to many artists and writers, but the most renowned one was Rachel Field, who was a award-winning author from the 1920s and 30s. And when I first stepped into the building, I felt transported by its creative presence in the air. And over time, I got intrigued with her life, and which was filled with mysteries and secrets. And I ended up spending 9 years doing the project. And in the end, I ended up with a hybrid book, because my journey of discovering sort of uncanny coincidences between Rachel's life and mine, and how she transformed my writing career and my personal life, all felt very relevant. So I wrote letters to her at the beginning of each chapter. So it's this threading of her biographical story and my memoir through letters.
And you stay in that house or own that house now?
It's a summer house, so we spend a lot of our summer times there. And in fact, I call it a 3-season house. We live only an hour and a half from the docks. We have to take a ferry to get there. There's no roads on the island, and so we get to go. It's quite secluded.
So when can we have a class reunion there?
That would be a trip.
It would be a trip. What did Rachel Field write? Was she
She was the first woman to win a Newbery Award for children's literature.
Oh, okay.
She was also a poet and a playwright. And then she moved to novels, and she won the National Book Award for her very first novel. Wow. And sold the movie rights, which enabled her to move to Hollywood with her husband. And her first Hollywood blockbuster film was nominated for Best Picture and had Betty Davis, who became a great friend. So she was really big, up and coming, and then died out of the blue when she was 47. She had a lot left to do.
What an extraordinary sort of 2 acts to her life, right?
Yeah.
To echo Scott Fitzgerald, the other Hollywood novelist, but to have lived on that island off the coast of Maine in isolation and be writing, and end up in Hollywood and also be successful. That's a great story.
Well, she spent the rest of her year, 8 months a year in New York City, and 4 months a year on this little island in Maine. It's really not habitable in the wintertime. So it was a summer retreat, late spring, early fall as well. Yeah, 4 months.
It is so cool that you bought it. You're the first person I know that owns a famous writer's house.
It's been a really intense an intense journey for me.
And before we have you read, how did you do all the research?
It was I started locally, and there's the Great Cranberry Island Historical Society has a dedicated corner to Rachel Field and Hitty, who was the doll star of her Newbery winning book. And then it expanded. I found archive collections in Massachusetts and Louisiana and Connecticut and New York. And I flew to California to the hospital where she died and got to look at the medical record book written in my hand. And so it was a wonderful treasure hunt.
And you were working on this during Stone Coast, if you said 9 years.
I did. I one of the reasons I applied to Stone Coast was to see if I could finish this doggone book, which was haunting me for so long. I kept trying to put it away, and then I feel like Rachel kept throwing it back in front of me, trying to get me to finish the job.
Wow. Well, let's hear from it, and we'll talk a little bit more after, but I'm really excited to hear it, Robin. Thank you for coming
so much. And thank you and Amanda so much for hosting this spectacular series. And Stone Coast continues to give. It's a wonderful program.
Yes, it does. And we give back.
Right.
All right. It's all you.
All right. I'm going to start by reciting to you the first thing I was familiar with, written by Rachel Field, and it's a poem. Her poetry is my favorite of her works, and you'll hear a few of her poems from me tonight. And this one is called If Once You Have Slept on an Island. If once you have slept on an island, you'll never be quite the same. You may look as you looked the day before and go by the same old name. You may bustle about in street and shop. You may sit at home and sew, but you'll see blue water and wheeling gulls wherever your feet may go. You may talk to your neighbors of this and that, and close to your fire keep, but you'll hear ship whistle and lighthouse bell, and tides beat through your sleep. Oh, you won't know why, and you can't say how such change upon you came, but once you have slept on an island, You'll never be quite the same. So that was the beginning of my inspiration with Rachel Field. And I'm going to read you the first 2 pages of the prologue to give you an introduction to this story. In 1994, my husband and I purchased a long-abandoned wood frame house on an island off the coast of Maine. In the 1920s and 30s, it had been the summer house of author Rachel Field on the island that inspired all her successful work, the poetry, plays, children's books, and novels that took her from struggling writer to Newbery medalist, National Book Award winner, then rising Hollywood success. At the peak of her renown, she died suddenly and unexpectedly, leaving so many stories untold, including her own. When I first walked into the island home that had been her magical place, her muse, some of those stories reached out tendrils looking for a place to attach themselves. I felt their presence in the flutters of my heart, but didn't know at the time what it meant. Many people know the sensation of entering an old house and feeling something of its history in the air. It whispers from the corners, buzzes indecipherably in the motes of dust illuminated by a ray of sunlight through wavy glass. The building retains some indefinable quality left behind by its former inhabitants, some of their energy lingering in the atmosphere. On an island with no roads, only footpaths and wooden wheelbarrows, the leavings of former inhabitants are not just figurative. Rachel's weighty wooden sleigh bed is still there in the room where she slept. The old wicker chairs in front of the fireplace creak under my weight as they creaked under hers. Her Scotty dog trinkets and paraphernalia wait expectantly, pointy ears on alert, on shelves and in drawers. I sit on the front porch, the covered piazza as Rachel called it, and I contemplate the same view of Seal Harbor and Acadia National Park's Rocky Top Mountains across an expanse of sea called the Eastern Way. That same view inspired Rachel's creative work, her joy and her loneliness. Rachel's life was not easy. It was not all fairy houses and moon glow or silver streaks of rain on city streets or soaring gulls alighting gracefully on the barnacled rocks of an island off the coast of Maine, even though her work is alive with all those wonders. It wasn't a life of deep deprivation either. Her family had enough means to get by and the social status to be accepted into most echelons of the stratified society of her time. The difficulties in Rachel's life were more situational and internal. First, there was her physical presence. Many who knew her effervescent spirit on the page were shocked to meet Rachel for the first time, for she was not the elfin sprite they expected, but a woman of imposing stature and heavy masculine features. Her warmth quickly eclipsed superficial impressions. She had a lightness about her, something open and engaging that made people feel like an old friend at her kitchen table. Nevertheless, her exterior self caused her a lifetime of rue. I also sensed that her story was weighty with much deeper disappointments, even before I'd begun my research. There were shadows of loss, heartbreak, secrecy, a sister gone mad, an improper marriage, infertility, a child who seemed to disappear. So many unanswered questions. But Rachel's story, I was certain, held more than anything a prodigious share of redemption and hopefulness. I was certain not only because of Rachel's work, but because I inhabited her space. So the next thing I'm going to read to you is a poem about Rachel's inside self and outside self. That she wrote a lot of children's literature in her earlier years, and this is a poem that's been anthologized quite a lot. My inside self and my outside self are different as can be. My outside self wears gingham smocks, and very round is she, with freckles sprinkled on her nose and smoothly parted hair, and clumsy feet that cannot dance in heavy shoes and square. But oh, my little inside self in gown of misty rose, she dances lighter than a leaf on blithe and twinkling toes. Her hair is blowing gold, and if you chanced her face to see, you would not think she could belong to staid and sober me. And along the same lines is this poem called The Quiet Child. By day, it's a very good girl, am I. I sit by the fire and sew. I darn the stockings and sweep the floors and hang the pots in a row. But oh, by night, when the candle's out and my bedroom black as pitch, I've just to crackle my thumbs to turn into a wild, bad witch. Nights of storm and nights of stars are all the same to me. It's up on my broom and straddle the wind as it whips my pigtails free. Over the chimney pots to go, past the jumbled lights of towns, with the hosts of good black trees beyond and dim sheep-sprinkled downs. No one knows when morning comes, and I'm back in bed once more, with tangled hair and eyes a-blink from the sunshine on the floor. No one knows of that witch who rode in the windy, dark, and wild, and I let them praise my sober ways and call me a quiet child. Now I'm going to read you some stuff from later in the book. And this, one of the big mysteries in Rachel's life was the source of her heartbreak. She had some poetry that talks about great heartbreak, and she came to, she found love very late in her life. And the source of her heartbreak was not the man she ended up marrying. And so I'm going to read you a little bit of my discoveries of this tumultuous passion of this period of her life. This is the beginning of a chapter called Mr. Mississippi. The contrast between Rachel's private and professional lives during the late 1920s and early 30s, the period when she brought Hitty to life, brings to mind her poem about her inside self and outside self. The burst of focused creativity and productivity that produced Hitty coincided with a tumultuous emotional period when Rachel was assailed simultaneously by previously unknown heights of elation and chasms of despair. For the first time in her life, at the age of 34, Rachel fell deeply, desperately in love. The poetry that begins to appear in her private journals bears witness. Love came late to me as spring to northern Maine, suddenly rearing its vehement green where snows have lately lain. Although her pragmatic Yankee exterior disallowed outward expressions of weakness or drama, inside she was aflame with a distracting passion for an achingly uncertain man. Only in her writing did Rachel allow her emotions a longer leash, and this time it was not just in private notebooks. The letters she wrote to the object of her desire, though they retain a degree of restraint and apology, also reveal the most unfiltered Rachel Field of any other preserved collection of her personal writings. At an age when she was beginning to feel the urgency of time's inevitable passage, she threw caution to the wind in a grasp for love and companionship in letters like this one. Oh, Lyle, it is wonderful to feel the way I do about your work, to know you couldn't do anything cheap or second rate if you tried to, and then to like you yourself just as much and more. Don't scold me, please, for saying that. You wouldn't if you knew how hard it was for me not to put two different middle letters in L-I-K-E. There are many passages of Rachel's letters throughout this book. In fact, later in the book, I let her tell more of her story than I do because her letters are quite beautiful. But those were difficult to read because there was a lot of pain in them. And here's a bit of a poem that Rachel wrote during the same period, and the pain of love poems, I call them. There was one called Because I Know, and it began this way. Because I know that clocks must tick our lives to dust someday, I will wind up the music box and listen to it play. The poem was abbreviated for publication, but these last two stanzas appear in her private papers. Because fear dogs the lightest foot, and envy and despair, I will put on my leaf green dress and pause to curl my hair. So I will smile and cherish toys and knickknacks till I die, since sadness comes so cheap to all, and anyone can cry. And that leaf green dress line particularly struck me because I read her make reference to impulse buy of a leaf green dress in a letter she wrote to Lyle. So that period of her life was particularly intense for me, where I could read these passionate letters and then see in her poetry the same emotional power. Okay, let's see, where's next? So the last two things I'm going to read to you are going to illustrate both Rachel's and my first arrival on Sutton Island. Rachel's was early on in 1911, I believe. And this chapter is called If Once You Have Slept on an Island, which was my original working title for the book. No one knew, least of all Rachel herself, how her life would be altered by her introduction to the Maine coast. From the year that I was 15, Rachel wrote in 1934, I have been going each summer to a small, beautiful, wooded island off the coast of Maine, and I suppose that it, more than any other thing in my life, has helped me with my writing, for it means roots and background to me. It creeps into nearly everything I write, and I never want to be anywhere else when summer comes round. Roots and background were essential forces throughout Rachel's life, but the roots and background of her Stockbridge ancestry faded out of sight once she had discovered Maine. And here's Rachel's voice in a letter again. One doesn't have to be born in a place to have roots there. I think one root struck down into Maine soil on my first visit to the state. It was when I was 15 years old, the most impressionable age. I shall never forget how I was stirred by my first view of the Maine coast, coming into Rockland in the early morning light. I felt an uplift as at no other place. In the firs pointing skyward, the glisten all around me, the old ships from distant ports at the wharves, these things still stir me. The last thing I'm going to read to you is one of my letters to Rachel early in the book, when I talked to her about my introduction to Sutton Island. Dear Rachel, one evening when I was at Yale, studying at a remote desk high in the stacks of the Sterling Memorial Library Tower, a boy called down the row of books to where I was sitting and asked me the time. I was buried in whatever it was I was reading, sitting on a creaky wooden chair, leaning over an ancient little desk in front of a leaded glass window. It was my favorite place to study when I wanted to immerse myself in a kind of romantic illusion, that I was part of an ancient tradition of scholars, engaged in the toil of opening shuttered windows in my brain to discover truth and wisdom. I know you never thought of yourself as a scholar, but your love of history and artifact and romantic connections to the past makes you one in my book. I imagine I blinked once or twice before I could focus on that boy who asked his question from down there at the end of the book-lined passage. I was likely lost in thought, a place I love to be lost. I've always felt a strong attraction to libraries, especially that musty, papery smell of hidden promise, as you walk down rows and rows of books stacked to the ceiling on either side. When I wanted to leave all distractions of the present world behind and enter a sort of sacred cerebral space, that's where I liked to go. It so happened that it was 5 minutes to closing time when this boy asked me the time. A short time later, I packed up my things and walked out, and there he was, leaving at the same time. Apparently that was no coincidence, but he didn't tell me that until years later. Each floor of Sterling's book-cramped stacks had a massive metal-lined door that you had to haul open when you left, a fire door to contain potential disasters. When you exited the stacks, the door closed ponderously behind you with a weighty, reverberant, metallic click that echoed up and down the stairwell. I was always stirred by that sound and waited for it before I'd begin my descent. I suspect I did the same that day, but probably surreptitiously, since that boy and I had already begun a friendly chat. We hit it off. I was cautious at first. He was disarmingly persistent in an unconventional way. He spent summers working on an apple farm, he said. Soon he started showing up at the dormitory suite I shared with several roommates. Rather than ask me out, he'd do things like pry off our doorknobs so he could use them to teach us all how to juggle. He always left something behind, a hat, a football, a book, so he had a reason to come by again. The reason why I'm telling you about Jonathan is because he is the one who introduced me to Sutton Island. In 1979, the first summer after we started seeing each other, he invited me to visit his family on an island off the coast of Maine. I was 18, only a few years older than you were when you first arrived on Sutton. And I responded to that magical place just as you did. I began to fall in love during that first visit with both boy and island. They have both been constants in my life for over 40 years now. Once I had slept on that island, I'd never be quite the same. In shared island appreciation, Robin. That's it.
Thank you, Robin.
My
So does that mean you're still in touch with that boy?
Yep, he's right in the other room.
That's a great story. Sincerely.
And but by the way, I wanted to say how much I enjoyed Melanie's reading as ever.
Yeah.
She did a spectacular job, and I too, I'm in line behind you, Troy, to read it when she's done.
Yeah, beautiful, so moving and so authentic.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued because now some of this is your memoir, Robin, or is it just the letters you write to her, or is this book about you, Dan?
Yeah, those letters is all the memoir there is. So the letters kind of track my not only my discovery of Rachel's story, but an accounting of myself and acceptance of the life path I chose, and the inspiration to feel empowered to pursue my writing life in my own time, which and I credit Rachel Field for a lot of that.
Wow. I know John Keats was obsessed with Shakespeare, rightly so, and he wondered if there were times that Shakespeare wasn't somehow spiritually communicating with him, though he was, of course, long dead. So
yeah,
other writers have wondered something or had that kind of relationship with a writer who's no longer present. But it's kind of a mystery story in a way, too, right? Like you said, improper marriage, lost child.
Yeah, there were certainly a lot of mysteries that piqued my curiosity, that kept me going. And
so in part, you solved those in the book.
I did pretty much all of the big ones. And you never find everything, as someone wisely said. The research is never done; you just have to start writing. So, but most of it was revealed to me sometimes through uncanny coincidences.
You write about that in the book, the uncanny coincidences?
Yes.
Okay, that's cool. See, that piques my interest again right there. I love that.
Yeah. And
how'd you get access to the letters again? That was at the Historical Society, or?
Well, there's archived. I'm very lucky because I've worked with some people. Like when I gave a talk at Stonecoast in January with a woman who did research on some African American lives from the 1800s, and there's just no records at all. I mean, there's not even birth records, and I felt like it was hard to find stuff on Rachel Field, and there's so much missing information. But compared to that, I had treasure trove. There's college libraries and the Library of Congress that have people's journals and people's letters to Rachel Field and from Rachel Field, and so that I found caches of her letters all over the country.
That's outstanding.
Yeah.
And thank you so much just for archiving that bit of literary history, which would not be accessible to most of us if you hadn't done that.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it
you're
was a cool time in history. She coincided with the explosion of children's literature as a recognized genre, and the first women in prominent positions in publishing houses, because women can do children's literature, so they let them in there. So.
All right, and then she won the book award, though. What
Yeah.
was the name of that novel that she won the book award for?
She won the book award for Time Out of Mind.
Okay.
But then in the end, the first movie was about was called All This and Heaven Too. That was the one with.
And she wrote the screenplay.
No, she did not.
Oh.
She consulted, but she did not.
Okay, it was an adaptation. That's a great title, All This in Heaven Too.
Yeah.
Well, we have a lot of homework, Robin. Thank you. Movie, a novel, and your book.
Oh, yeah. She wrote like 32 books if you include all her children's stuff and her poetry books. So, yeah, she'll keep you busy for a while.
And you live in Maine, do you, Robin?
I do.
Okay, good for you. It's such a great community of writers out there.
It's a thriving writing community. Yeah.
I know. I'd move there if I didn't have children or grandchildren. I don't know what and a job. But do you anything else you want to add, or we'll bring Melanie back and you guys can talk a little bit if you'd like.
I would be happy to have people look at my website. I have lots of online events coming up. That's the advantage to the giving a book launch when you're isolated, is that people can come from all over the world to attend the online events. Sure. So if you go to my website and look at the events listings, there's all kinds of stuff happening.
Fantastic. And we're scrolling it there at the bottom. So
nice.
Thank you, Amanda, for doing that. All right, Melanie, are you out there? Amanda, you want to come on and ask questions, say hi?
I'm here.
Hey, Amanda.
Hey. That was great, Robin.
Thank you. We should also tell them, Melanie, that you and I are hosting one of these events coming up.
Right, at the end of June. What's the date? I should have it.
I think it's June 30th.
June 30th.
Okay.
June 30th.
June 30th.
Wyndham Library in Maine is hosting it, and that's going to be online.
Yeah. With another fellow Stone Coast grad, my dear friend Jennifer Dupree, who is a librarian there. So, yeah. Well, that was great, Robin. I can't get over the amount of research that went into that book. You know, I missed that. It just must have been fascinating for you. And I love the way you weave in the, kind of little strands of your personal connection to the place, but then a lot of her work and then biographical information as well. So beautiful.
Yeah, I had fun kind of piecing something together for tonight, because it was hard to know where, I couldn't really think of any particular place to read a continuous stretch without giving away spoilers or having people get lost. So I hope that gave a little taste of the various parts of the book.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Robin, I was fortunate enough to go to your first official event, which was such a delight. I've read snippets of this over time, but I think this was the first time that I've actually heard one of your letters to Rachel Fields, that portion of the book, and it was just I was so surprised and then also so moved, and it just was I'm so excited about. I have it and I haven't started it yet, but I'm very excited about how those pieces kind of string the whole thing together.
Yeah. And Amanda has slept on that island, by the way.
And Robin, I act okay, of course I was, this whole time I'm thinking I'm so fortunate to have been able to spend time at the house, but you said that it was a stock photo on the cover, and I would not have noticed that it was a stock photo. You should
I shouldn't have told you.
You should tell people that it's a real photo.
Yeah.
People would believe you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, everyone, for a great night. Thank you, Amanda, for joining me as co-host. I really enjoyed that. Melanie, Robin, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your work. It was a pleasure for me, as it is every week.
And Melanie,
thank you.
Some lucky publisher is going to snatch that story up, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Robin. From your lips to God's ears.
I know.
So, yeah,
If Amanda or I win the lottery, we're going to start a publishing house and get this stuff.
awesome.
There's so much
Exactly.
good material on
Take
this.
away the whole purgatory of querying and
Yeah.
all that stuff. That'd be awesome. So
Yeah.
thanks you guys for doing this. It's so great. I've loved like jumping on here and hearing people that I knew from Stone Coast and people that I didn't know, and you know, hearing them read. So I really appreciate you guys keeping this going and inviting us to be part of it.
You're very welcome. We'll have you both back, and we'll keep doing it because I enjoy it as much as Amanda.
Awesome.
All
Great.
right,
Thank you. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
We'll put up a new schedule.
Take
We don't have
care.
anything booked yet, but we're going to work on it over the next week. So,
All
night,
right.
everybody.
Come
Bye-bye.
join us.
Good night.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.